Welcome to the show. You're listening to Green Hell, a Vietnam War podcast. Join me as I explore the history of the Vietnam War, remember the sacrifices and experiences of those who were there, and preserve those lessons learned and paid for through blood and unimaginable human suffering. I'm your host, Stephen Comstock, and as of this recording, it is February 19th, 2025. So today's episode is a little different. The following is a short story written by yours truly. It's intended to give voice to some perspective and capture some of the nuance that I think is lost in the episodes where I just kind of regurgitate history. I'm trying to spice things up a little bit. So going forward, I'll be doing many more of these kind of character profile episodes, and they're going to be based on a wide array of lived experiences from the First Indochina War. While this story is fictional, the types of events, attitudes, and emotions here reflected were not and would have occurred many times over. This story follows a Senegalese colonial soldier named Batu. One aspect of the First Indochina War that I find fascinating is that many of those who fought against the Viet Minh were themselves from colonies of the French Empire. Undoubtedly, some were coerced into service, others promised wealth and adventure, and others yet truly believed that French imperialism created more good than it did bad in the world. As of 2025, all of France's colonies have been relinquished and are now independent, and it makes one wonder what could have happened if Emperor Bao Dai's associated state of Vietnam, backed by France, had been allowed to proceed as the French had planned. Where would Vietnam be today? We'll never know the answer to that question, but what we do know is that hardcore communists operating the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and backed by the Chinese Communist Party were hell-bent on never allowing such a scenario from occurring. And while looking back at history with the clarity of 2020 hindsight and playing the what-if game can contribute to humanity's collected wisdom in navigating the future that bears semblance to past events, I think it may be more important to remember that historical events are ultimately a convergence of an unfathomable number of events driven by innumerable motives ranging from the individual to the collective. That's to say, history is an emergent phenomenon rather than a top-down process. Or to quote from Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, "To us, to posterity, who contemplate the movement of humanity in its entirety from a distance, its causes appear as the sum total of the wills of all individuals. But to the actors themselves, each moved by his own desires, feelings, and passions, these causes seem to be distinct, separate, and comprehensible only in relation to their own lives." And to cite Tolstoy a moment longer, "The movement of nations is caused not by power, not by intellectual activity, nor even by a combination of the two, as historians have supposed, but by the activity of all the people who participate in the events, and who always combine in such a way that those who take the largest direct share in the event take on themselves the least responsibility, and vice versa." And so, without further ado, and with those words in mind, I present to you the story of Batu. It's been said, justice is the advantage of the stronger over the weaker. For Batu, nothing was truer. Life wasn't fair and never would be. It wasn't something he dwelt much on either. Certainly, if he'd been a learned man, he'd adopt one of the more extreme strains of existentialism circulating in Parisian cafes. Regardless, Batu learned all he needed from two people. One, his father, a fisherman born and raised on the Wolof riverine culture of the Senegal River, and two, the French non-commissioned officer, Sergeant Bordeaux, who taught him combat tactics before Mother France assigned him to the 5th Battalion, Senegalese Tirailleurs. The 5th was destined for Indochina, and by 1949, Batu stood out as a natural fighter. Despite the peaceful nature of his Wolof heritage, he found a certain solitude in the chaos of combat. 22 years old, and he'd already been baptized in the Temple of Mars and initiated to the inner school. Stationed in an outpost outside Saigon, Batu and 30 of his comrades were tasked with maintaining the French presence in the borderlands of colonial control in the south. For several weeks, the gravity of the danger was lost on his outfit. Their daily experience involved searching porters, occasionally finding contraband, supplies, and piastres headed north to the DRV-held zones and handing the guilty to the French intelligence services. The Viet Minh didn't really frighten him. They seemed mostly like poor peasants throwing pebbles at giants. While pulling guard from one of 4 concrete pillboxes, configured in adjacent fashion on either side of the road and barrier gate, Batu told jokes with his comrades, smoked cigarettes, and peered occasionally into the darkness. As he reminisced on childhood jovialities, flashing lights twinkled curiously in the distance, piercing the inky black of night. His brain registered the oddity as gunfire only as bullets whizzed past his face. Blood splattered warmly on his face and neck. A stray round found his companion, Private Demba's forehead. Gore and gray matter painted the rear of the bunker. A terrible physical reaction cascaded down from the top of his scalp to the pit of his stomach, making him puke and seizing him with terror. He was paralyzed, hardly comprehending this moment where jovial stories from his youth morphed to the grotesque visage of his friend's faceless expression. The machine gun in the bunker blew forth fire that illuminated in pulses the full display of carnage he now shared proximity with. The concussive resonance of hundreds of rounds roaring downrange bounced around the concrete walls. He felt them pounding his ear and sinus cavities. "Get on the fucking gun!" shouted Sergeant Dubois, his other companion that night. Disgust and paralyzing terror released control when the fact of his own mortality arrived. He bounded to the other machine gun, snapped the safety off, and returned fire in the direction of the flashing lights on the edge of the abyss beyond the loophole of the bunker. If he could hear at all in that moment, he'd only hear the screams of Viet Minh guerrillas shouting, Senegalese men screaming, enemy recoilless rifle rounds and grenades battering the pillbox exterior. Batu didn't need to hear anything. He felt it all. Concussive blast waves from explosions and gunfire passed through his body like the evil spirits the Wolof witch doctors warned against. Little did he know that, like demons, the physical toll of blast overpressure would leave him with an as of then unknown and untreatable case of traumatic brain injury that would haunt him and erode his soul. For a moment that stretched to the void itself, he was neither conscious nor unconscious of his actions. He was fully engaged in the convergence of focus and muscle memory only possible through intense and disciplined combat training. When the belt-fed machine gun expended its last round, he reflexively popped the feed tray cover open, swept away loose links, replaced a new belt, and dumped lead again and again in deafening long bursts. With each burst, something predatory emerged in him, and he screamed a fierce battle cry of anguished rage. The third reload, however, nearly ended him. The immediate stores of ammo had been expended. Nearly 5 minutes of continuous firing had turned the barrel of his machine gun red hot, and in the acrid smoky haze of spent gunpowder, Batu realized he was alone. Sergeant Dubois was crumpled and split in half from a rocket that exploded at the corner of the bunker loophole. Not considering the sight, Batu searched with his hands in the black corner of the bunker for ammo reserved for Dubois' now silent gun. The barrel of Dubois' gun was much cooler, the ammo much nearer, so Batu did not move back to his previous position. He loaded the gun stationed on the parapet above the disassembled remains of his team leader and friend. On the periphery, keen-eyed Viet Minh lying on the ground in the shadows noticed when the pillbox ceased singing. They stood up and charged, screaming, Tien Lien! Grenades in hand. To Batu, they were wraiths spawning from the blackness in real time. They came rushing and he knew he would die. The concertina wire, 50 meters on the perimeter, was already littered with the corpses of the first wave mowed down. The body served to allow the second wave to bound over and into the perimeter. Someone cried in French a warning, and at that moment 3 things happened in rapid succession. First, an illumination round from the local artillery support unit made clear the enemy clawing their way to close with and destroy. Second, Batu's gun roared to life and he cut down the 4 charging Viet Minh. He couldn't see the 5 others charging behind. And third, artillery support rained down on the perimeter and killed or dispersed the remaining guerrillas. The 105 howitzer shells set to airburst showered the ground beneath with razor-sharp and infernally hot shrapnel. Batu ducked beneath the parapet of the pillbox and waited for the deafening, teeth-rattling explosions to cease. When the shells stopped 2 minutes later, an inky darkness and infinite silence took the place of bedlam and chaos. A ringing in Batu's ears, the only thing available to his auditory sense. The afterimage of the flare, now extinct, the glowing machine gun barrel, and the flash of cloud lightning in the distance were all he could see. Someone grabbed Batu's arm and shook him to gain his attention and break the spell of confusion. The Paris-born French lieutenant who commands his platoon looked in his eyes, relieved that he found one more of his men alive. Maybe in Parisian high society there were racial dividing lines between classes, but in the outposts and bunkers of Indochina there were only Frenchmen and enemies, and both the French lieutenant from Paris and the Senegalese soldier from Kaolack loved each other as family. The French ethos of brotherhood had never felt more real to Batu than at that moment, in that pillbox and on that night. Fate chose your tribe. He was thankful his was backed by the might and sophistication of Mother France. Batu, Jesus Christ, are you okay, man? Lieutenant Pierre's eyes glistened in the light of a newly deployed flare, wide with horror, ingesting the full scene of carnage in the pillbox. Batu nodded with the meekness inherent a private addressing an officer. Lieutenant Pierre wasted no time, whipped out his electric torch, and inspected Batu for unnoticed life-threatening injuries. On declaring him fit for duty, he handed over a canteen, ordered him to take a drink, and then with an endearing pat on the shoulder gave instruction to reload the gun and prepare for a second wave. While the guerrillas had fallen back, battered and bloody with no intentions of coming back, the rest of the night was one spent anxiously on high alert. Flares burned in and out all night, and the weary men of the outpost now fought a second fight against the fatigue inevitable after an adrenaline dump such as they had had. Lieutenant Pierre spent the night making the rounds through the 4 pillboxes of the outpost every 15 minutes, passing out cigarettes, kicking awake dozing men as necessary, and steadying their nerves until daylight arrived and shone its blessing down on living and dead alike. When the sun rose, a new charge of energy infused the French soldiers and illuminated in every detail the gruesome outcomes of their friends and enemy. Batu was ordered, along with the other privates, to collect the bodies of friends and enemies, disentangle the stiff corpses of Viet men caught in the sea wire, and clear and clean the bunkers. The French dead were placed in body bags and lined side by side in posthumous camaraderie. The Viet men were tossed unceremoniously into a mass grave which Batu and others spent 4 hours digging in the unrelenting heat. Worse than the heat was the incessant buzzing and swarms of flies. A convoy of supply trucks, APCs, and heavy equipment heading back to Saigon collected the French fallen. The grave of the enemy was plowed over, and Batu was grateful that the chore was done for him, saving him the agony of doing it shovelfuls at a time. In shifts, the battle-weary rotated for a few hours of sleep. When Batu retook his place again in the bunker, bloodstains in the concrete served as proof that the night before hadn't been a dream, and that the Viet men were far more than peasants hurling pebbles at giants. Lieutenant Pierre promoted Batu to corporal, citing his discipline and skill in the face of a determined enemy. By keeping the gun up, he saved the outpost from being overrun by Viet Minh guerrillas. Corporal Batu felt proud to be part of the mighty French Empire and couldn't understand why the Vietnamese people didn't want to take part in the glory offered by Mother France. To Batu, the logic was clear. Refuse the gifts offered by Mother France and stand against her with arms, then you must be destroyed. The abstractions of political nuance were beyond his understanding. He was a soldier sent to Indochina to fight for France. His homeland had become a part of French colonial rule in 1895, and while the French could be ruthless, so could the warring Wolof kingdoms of Jolof, Kayor, Baol, Walo, and Sine-Salom. Neither the Islamic kingdoms nor the others abstained from selling slaves, but it was Mother France who abolished slavery in 1848. Mother France built railways and roads, developed cities and blessed them with ports, schools, hospitals, and police stations. Mother France brought Senegal the common tongue of the literate and civilized people of the world so that they too could participate in the exchange of ideas through literature, art, philosophy, and religion. Representative democracy was born in the minds and hearts of the Senegalese thanks to Mother France. And of course, Batu was no fool. He heard the rumblings of discontent by some crying exploitation by the whites. He'd seen racial animosity and class distinction. Who hadn't? But likewise, he knew people from Senegalese who hated others from Jollof for all the same reasons people hate each other, and their skin color was the exact same. Everyone wished they could be higher on the food chain, but that is fantasy, and this is reality. You accept the blessings offered by Mother France and give thanks to be born under the unifying structure of French imperialism. A few months later, the new year arrived, but 1950 brought with it nothing new. Batu and his platoon engaged in skirmishes and all-out assaults that steadily increased in frequency and intensity. His animosity for the Viet Minh grew proportionately more extreme. French intelligence reports told of renewed efforts by General Nguyen Bien's Viet Minh army to retake control of the Mekong Delta and Saigon. Ambushes and raids occurred throughout the countryside, along the supply routes, and acts of terrorism and sabotage dominated the cities. Earlier in the week, Lieutenant Pierre read aloud a report that detailed the assassination of several French officers, their children, housekeepers, and a few other civilian Vietnamese attending a dinner party at a French official's house. 8 officers, 2 French administrators, 6 children, and 4 Vietnamese civilians were cut down by savages. Lieutenant Pierre passed around pictures of the carnage to remind the men who they were up against. The image of children in pools of blood bothered him deeply. He could not understand what grievances the Viet Minh could possibly harbor that would allow them to murder children in cold blood. He understood clearly what it meant to be at war with an evil and savage enemy. He understood that while many of the Viet Minh were poor and illiterate, and some might argue misled, the fact remained that the only thing standing against the rise of evil men was he and his comrades, on behalf of civilization and on behalf of Mother France. As Batu survived more battles and buried more corpses, both friend and enemy alike, he would often stare out into the inky blackness while on watch and contemplate deeply the words that once comforted him but now disturbed him. La justice est l'avantage du plus fort sur le plus faible. Justice is the advantage of the stronger over the weaker.